Welcome to Nighttime History. Before we begin, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, and let yourself relax completely. Subscribe for nightly uploads and become part of our community of nighttime travelers. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, so take a moment to let us know where you're settling down to sleep tonight. Whether you're in a cozy bedroom, on a comfortable couch, or anywhere else in the world. Welcome. Today we will walk through an entire day in the life of a medieval monk, experiencing each moment as it unfolds within the thick stone walls of the monastery. Let yourself settle into the quiet rhythm of monastic life as we journey together through the hours of prayer, work, and contemplation that shape every single day. The darkness before dawn is complete and absolute. There are no streetlights here, no glowing devices, nothing but the deep black of night that presses against the small window of his cell. The stone walls around him hold the cold of winter, and his breath makes small clouds in the air. He lies on a simple straw mattress covered with a rough woolen blanket, and for a moment everything is perfectly still. Then he hears it. The bell. Its sound cuts through the silence, echoing down the long corridors of the monastery. This is the bell for vigils, the first prayer service of the day, and it rings while the world outside still sleeps. The bell's tone is clear and insistent, calling him from whatever dreams he might have been having. There is no snooze button here, no option to roll over and steal a few more minutes of warmth. The bell rings, and he must rise. He swings his legs out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold stone floor. The shock of it wakes him more fully. He reaches for his habit in the darkness, the heavy wool fabric stiff and cool against his skin. His fingers work automatically, tying the rope belt around his waist, pulling the hood up over his head. He has done this countless times before, in darkness just like this, and his body knows the movements without needing thought. The corridor outside his cell is lined with other doors, and he can hear the soft sounds of his brothers also rising, also dressing, also preparing for prayer. No one speaks. The rule of silence governs these hours. And besides, there is nothing that needs to be said. They all know where they are going and what they must do. He makes his way through the passageways, his footsteps joining with others, creating a soft shuffling sound against the stone. The monastery is a maze of corridors and staircases, all built from the same grey stone, all lit by the occasional flickering candle in a wall sconce. The candlelight catches on the rough texture of the walls, creating dancing shadows that move as he passes. The church is the heart of the monastery, and as he enters through the heavy wooden door, he feels the space open up around him. The ceiling soars high above, supported by thick columns that disappear into shadow. The air here is different. It carries the scent of incense and candle wax and old stone. It is a smell that has built up over years, maybe centuries, and it speaks of countless prayers offered in this exact spot. He moves to his place in the choir stalls, the wooden seats arranged in rows facing each other across the central aisle. The wood is smooth under his hands, worn down by generations of monks who have stood here before him. Around him, his brothers are also taking their places, each one moving with the same quiet purpose, the same disciplined calm. The abbot enters, and the service begins. The prayers of vigils are sung in Latin, the words flowing in the ancient rhythms of Gregorian chant. His voice joins with the others, creating a sound that seems to fill the entire space, rising up to the vaulted ceiling and settling into the corners. The chant has no harmony in the modern sense, just a single melodic line that everyone follows together, creating a sound that is both simple and profound. He sings the psalms, the same psalms that monks have been singing at this hour for hundreds of years. The words are so familiar that he barely needs to think about them, and yet each time he sings them, they seem to reveal something new, some small insight or comfort. The Latin syllables roll off his tongue, and he lets the meaning wash over him without forcing it. The service continues for perhaps an hour, maybe longer. Time feels different here in the darkness, measured not by minutes but by prayers, by the number of psalms sung, by the slow burning down of the candles. When the final blessing is given, he bows his head and crosses himself, then files out of the church with the others, back into the cold corridors. But he does not return to bed. Once he is awake for vigils, the day has truly begun, even though dawn is still perhaps 2 hours away. Some of his brothers head to the warming room, the one place in the monastery where a fire is kept burning, where they are allowed to go to take the chill off before the next service. Others return to their cells for private prayer and meditation. He decides to go to the scriptorium. The scriptorium is quieter than the church and smaller, with a lower ceiling and rows of wooden desks arranged beneath the windows. Of course, the windows show nothing but darkness now, but in a few hours they will let in the light that is so essential for the work done here. This is where manuscripts are copied, where knowledge is preserved and passed on, where the steady work of writing continues day after day, year after year. He lights a candle at his desk and sits down on the wooden stool. The manuscript he has been working on lies exactly where he left it yesterday, the parchment held flat by small weights at the corners. He is copying a psalter, each letter formed with careful precision, each line straight and even. The work requires absolute concentration, because a single mistake means scraping off the ink and starting that section again, and parchment is far too valuable to waste. He picks up his quill, checking the nib to make sure it is still sharp enough. The ink in the small pot beside him is thick and black, made from oak galls and iron salts, mixed with gum arabic to help it flow. He dips the quill carefully, tapping off the excess, and then touches it to the parchment. The scratch of the quill is the only sound in the room. Each letter takes shape slowly, built up from individual strokes. First the main vertical line, then the curves and cross strokes that distinguish one letter from another. He works from left to right across the page, his hands steady, his breathing slow and even. This is meditative work that requires him to be fully present in each moment, attending to each tiny detail. After perhaps an hour, he hears the bell again. This is the bell for Lauds, the morning prayer that marks the official beginning of the day. He carefully cleans his quill and caps the ink, then makes his way back to the church. The sky outside is just beginning to show the first pale grey of dawn, not yet true light, but no longer complete darkness either. Lauds follows the same structure as vigils, more psalms, more prayers, all sung in the same ancient chant. But there is a different feeling to this service, a sense of anticipation, a new beginning. As he sings, he can see through the high windows that the sky is growing lighter, shifting from black to deep blue to grey. By the time the service ends, dawn has truly arrived, and the world is visible again. After Lauds comes Prime, another brief service of prayer. The offices of prayer punctuate the entire day, dividing it into segments, ensuring that no matter what work he is doing, he returns again and again to the central purpose of monastic life, which is prayer and worship. Prime is shorter than Lauds or vigils, but it follows the same pattern, the same rhythms of chant and psalm. When Prime concludes, there is finally a break in the sequence of prayers, and it is time for the first meal of the day. He files into the refectory with the other monks, taking his assigned place at the long wooden tables. The refectory is a large room with whitewashed walls and narrow windows set high up. At one end is the abbot's table, raised on a small platform. On the opposite wall is a pulpit where one of the brothers will read during the meal. The meal itself is simple, as all meals in the monastery are simple. There is bread, baked fresh each day in the monastery's own ovens, with a crust that cracks when broken and a soft interior that is still slightly warm. There is pottage, a thick soup made from vegetables and grains, seasoned with herbs from the monastery garden. There is ale, small beer brewed weak enough to drink throughout the day, safer than water and providing necessary calories. He eats in silence, listening to the brother who reads from the pulpit. Today, the reader shares from the lives of the saints, stories of holy men and women who lived centuries ago, who performed miracles and endured suffering for their faith. The voice carries clearly through the room, and as he eats his simple meal, he lets the words wash over him, considering their meaning, thinking about what lessons they might hold. The bread is good, dense, and satisfying, made from wheat flour mixed with some rye. He chews it slowly, grateful for this sustenance. The pottage is thick enough that his spoon stands up in it, full of barley and onions and turnips. It warms him from the inside, driving away the last of the morning's chill. He drinks the ale from a wooden cup, the taste slightly sour but not unpleasant. When the meal is finished, the abbot stands and offers a prayer of thanksgiving. They all stand with him, bowing their heads, then file out of the refectory in the same orderly silence they filed in. The morning is now fully underway, and it is time for the main work period of the day. For him, this means returning to the scriptorium. Other monks have different assignments. Some work in the garden, tending the vegetables and herbs that will provide food and medicine. Some work in the kitchen, preparing the day's main meal. Some work in the brewery or the bakery. Some attend to the maintenance of the monastery itself, repairing stonework or woodwork, cleaning the church, managing the candles and altar cloths. But he is a scribe, and his work is in the scriptorium. He returns to his desk, to the manuscript that waits for him, and he lights the candles, even though daylight is now coming through the windows. The natural light is better for working, truer in colour, easier on the eyes, but the candles provide additional illumination for the detailed work. He settles back onto his stool and picks up his quill. The page before him is partially completed, the text running in neat lines across the parchment. He finds where he left off and begins again, dipping the quill, tapping off the excess ink, touching it to the page. Scratch, scratch, scratch goes the quill, a sound so familiar it is almost like silence. The work demands everything from him. His eyes must focus on each tiny letter. His hand must remain steady, forming each stroke with precision. His mind must hold the text he is copying, usually just a few words at a time, transferring them from the exemplar beside him to the fresh parchment before him. There is no room for distraction, no space for wandering thoughts. Time passes. The sun climbs higher, and the light through the windows grows stronger. Around him, other monks are engaged in their own copying work. Occasionally, someone rises to sharpen a quill or to mix more ink. But mostly there is just the collective sound of quills scratching on parchment, a gentle, persistent rustling like wind through dry leaves. His hand begins to cramp, and he pauses to flex his fingers, to roll his shoulders, to look away from the page and let his eyes rest for a moment. This is demanding work, and he must pace himself. A day of copying might produce only a single page, maybe two if the text is simple and requires no decoration. The manuscript he is working on will take months to complete, and it will join dozens of others in the monastery's library, a collection of books that represents not just knowledge but countless hours of patient, careful labour. He thinks about the monks who will come after him, who will read the manuscript he is creating, who will run their eyes over these very letters that he is forming right now. He thinks about the chain of transmission that stretches back through time, text copied from text, each one made by hand, each one carrying forward the words and ideas of scripture and philosophy and history. As mid-morning approaches, he hears the bell again calling him to terce, the third hour prayer. He cleans his quill and makes his way once more to the church. The services of terce, sext and none, the prayers of the third, sixth and ninth hours, are briefer than the night offices, but they serve the same purpose, pulling him back from his work and reorienting him toward prayer and contemplation. Terce is sung quickly, and soon he is back in the scriptorium, back at his desk, back to the slow, patient work of copying. The morning continues, measured not by the clock, but by the movement of sunlight across the floor, by the gradual filling of the page before him, by the steady rhythm of the quill. The morning work continues in the scriptorium, and he loses himself in the familiar rhythm. Each letter is a small act of devotion, each word a prayer in its own way. The parchment before him gradually fills with text, line by line, the black ink stark against the pale surface. He works with the patience that comes from knowing this manuscript will outlast him, will be read by people not yet born, will carry these sacred words forward through time. Around him, his fellow scribes maintain their own silent concentration. Brother Thomas sits 2 desks away, working on an illuminated gospel book, his desk covered with small pots of pigment in brilliant colours. Red made from crushed insects, blue from ground lapis lazuli, brought all the way from distant mountains, gold leaf that catches the light and seems to glow. Brother Thomas will spend hours on a single decorated initial letter, building up layers of colour, adding tiny details that require a steady hand and perfect vision. Brother William, the eldest of the scribes, works near the window where the light is best. His manuscript is a medical text, copied from an ancient Greek source that has been translated into Latin. Brother William moves more slowly than the younger monks, his hand sometimes trembling slightly, but his letters are still perfectly formed, still precise and beautiful. He has been a scribe for 40 years, and he will continue until his eyes or his hands give out completely. The sound of their combined work is like a kind of music, the scratching of quills on parchment, the occasional soft rustle as someone turns a page in their exemplar, the quiet tap of a quill being dipped into an inkwell. Outside the windows, birds call to each other, and somewhere in the distance a cow lows. The monastery is part of a working estate, with fields and pastures and orchards, all managed by the monks and the lay brothers who assist them. He finishes another line and pauses, reading back over what he has written to check for errors. The Latin flows smoothly, the familiar words of the psalm speaking of God's protection and mercy. He has copied these words before in other manuscripts, and he will copy them again. There is comfort in this repetition, in knowing that these same words have been copied by countless monks in countless monasteries across Christendom. The light shifts as clouds move across the sun, and the quality of illumination in the room changes. He looks up from his work, giving his eyes a rest, and watches the play of light and shadow on the stone wall across from him. Everything here is stone, thick walls that will stand for centuries, floors worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, narrow windows with deep embrasures that keep out the worst of the wind and weather. His stomach begins to remind him that the small breakfast was several hours ago, but he ignores it. The main meal of the day will not come until after sext, the midday prayer, and until then he must focus on his work. Hunger is familiar, almost comfortable. The monastic life involves many small deprivations, many opportunities to master the needs and desires of the body, to remind oneself that the spirit is more important than physical comfort. The bell rings for sext, its voice carrying clearly through the stone corridors, and he sets down his quill with a sense of gratitude. His back aches from sitting hunched over the desk, and his eyes are tired from the close work. He stands carefully, stretching his spine, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers. Around him, the other scribes are doing the same, all of them moving with the stiffness of men who have been sitting still for hours. They process together to the church once more, their sandals whispering against the stone floors. The midday service is brief, but welcome. A chance to stand and sing, to breathe deeply and let his voice join with his brothers in the familiar chants. The Psalms for sext speak of God's faithfulness and steadfast love, themes that have echoed through these walls for as long as the monastery has stood. When sext concludes, it is finally time for the main meal of the day. The refectory feels warmer now, the pale winter sun coming through the high windows and touching the whitewashed walls. The monks take their places at the long tables, and there is a palpable sense of anticipation. This meal will be more substantial than the morning bread and pottage. The servers, monks assigned to kitchen duty for the week, bring out the food. There are wooden bowls of thick vegetable stew, rich with turnips and cabbage and leeks from the monastery's own garden. There are trenchers of bread, thick slices that serve as both plate and food, soaking up the juices from the stew. There is cheese, hard yellow cheese made from the milk of the monastery's cows, sharp and salty on the tongue. There is more ale, and for some of the older monks, a small measure of wine. He eats slowly, mindfully, paying attention to each bite. The stew is hot and savoury, seasoned with herbs that one of the brothers has dried and stored from the summer garden. The bread is dense and chewy, made from a mixture of wheat and barley. The cheese is strong and satisfying, providing fat and protein that his body needs. The reader today continues with the lives of the saints, the voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadences of Latin prose. The story being read is about a desert father, one of those ancient monks who went into the wilderness to pray and fast and wrestle with demons, both literal and figurative. The tale speaks of miraculous endurance, of visions and revelations, of a life stripped down to its absolute essentials. He listens as he eats, drawing connections between the ancient saint's life and his own. He is not in a desert, and he does not face the same dramatic trials, but the underlying principle is the same. The monastic life is about setting aside worldly concerns, about dedicating oneself entirely to God, about finding meaning and purpose in prayer and work and community. The meal ends with another prayer of thanksgiving, and then the monks file out into the cloister for the brief recreation period that follows the midday meal. The cloister is a covered walkway that runs around the central courtyard of the monastery with a garden in the middle. In summer, that garden is full of flowers and herbs, but now in winter it is mostly bare earth and the brown stalks of dormant plants. The monks walk slowly around the cloister, and here the rule of silence is relaxed slightly. Quiet conversation is permitted, a chance to share news or ask questions. to maintain the social bonds that are part of community life. He walks with Brother Martin, a younger monk who works in the monastery's infirmary, caring for the sick and elderly. Brother Martin speaks softly about one of the older monks who is failing, whose body is wearing out after decades of faithful service. They discuss whether there is anything more that can be done, what herbs might ease the old man's pain, how to keep him comfortable. It is a somber conversation, but not a sad one. Death is a familiar presence here, understood as a transition rather than an ending, the moment when a faithful soul finally goes home to God. They complete one circuit of the cloister, then another, their footsteps echoing softly under the vaulted ceiling. Other monks pass them going the opposite direction, some walking in pairs, some alone, all moving in the same measured pace. The cold air feels good after the warmth of the refectory, sharp and clean in the lungs. The bell rings for none, the 9th hour prayer ending the recreation period. They return to the church once more, taking their places in the choir stalls. The afternoon light slants through the windows at a different angle now, creating patterns on the stone floor. He sings the psalms with his brothers, his voice blending into the collective sound, and feels the familiar centering that comes with this regular return to prayer. After none, it is time for the afternoon work period. He returns to the scriptorium, to his desk, to the manuscript that waits patiently for him. The afternoon light is different from the morning light, warmer and more golden, and it requires him to adjust the angle of his work slightly to avoid shadows. He picks up his quill and continues where he left off. The psalm he is copying moves through images of God as shepherd, as rock, as fortress. The Hebrew poetry, translated into Latin, still carries its power, its rhythm and repetition, creating patterns of meaning that go beyond the literal definitions of words. His hand moves across the parchment with practiced ease. After years of this work, the formation of letters has become almost automatic, his muscles remembering the shapes, his eye judging the spacing without conscious thought. And yet he must still concentrate, must still attend to each detail, because even the smallest error would mar the page. The afternoon passes in this focused quiet. Occasionally he hears sounds from elsewhere in the monastery, the distant clang of a bell from the forge where one of the brothers is working metal, the lowing of cattle being brought in from the fields, the creak of the windlass as someone draws water from the well. But these sounds are muted, filtered through stone walls, and they do not break his concentration. His hand cramps again, more insistently this time, and he sets down the quill to rest. He looks at what he has accomplished today. 3/4 of a page, the text marching in neat lines across the parchment. It is good work, careful work, and when this manuscript is complete, it will take its place in the library, where it will be preserved and protected, where it will be available for study and prayer. He thinks about the library, that treasure house of knowledge, tucked away in the north wing of the monastery. Shelves and shelves of manuscripts, some ancient and fragile, some newly made, covering every subject the monks need to know. Scripture and theology, of course, but also history and philosophy, medicine and mathematics, agriculture and astronomy. The monastery is a repository of learning, a place where knowledge is preserved through the centuries. Brother Thomas, at the next desk, is working on one of the elaborate decorated capitals that will mark the beginning of a new gospel. He has sketched the design lightly in lead point, and now he is applying the gold leaf, breathing softly on it to make it adhere to the sticky gum beneath. The gold catches the light and gleams, transforming the page into something precious and beautiful. He watches for a moment, admiring Brother Thomas's skill. He himself is not trained in illumination. His talent is for the steady production of clear, readable text. but he appreciates the artistry of those who can create these glowing pages, these manuscripts that are not just books but works of art, offerings of beauty to God. The afternoon wears on. The light begins to fade as the winter sun sinks lower in the sky. He continues to work, knowing that soon the bell will ring for Vespers and the workday will end. Just a few more lines, a few more words, the quill scratches on, the ink flows, the text grows. Finally, the bell rings. Vespers, the evening prayer, the service that marks the transition from day to night. He cleans his quill carefully, caps his ink, covers the manuscript to protect it from dust. His back aches as he stands, and his eyes are tired, but there is satisfaction in the work completed, in the steady progress made. He joins his brothers in the procession to the church. The evening light is failing now, and candles have been lit throughout the building. Their warm glow creates a different atmosphere, softer and more intimate than daylight. The evening office feels like a gathering, a coming together at the end of the day's labours. The psalms for Vespers speak of evening and rest, of God's protection through the night. The chant rises and falls, the ancient melodies carrying the words up into the vaulted spaces above. He sings with his whole heart, grateful for the day's work, grateful for the community of brothers around him, grateful for this life of prayer and purpose. When Vespers ends, there is time for a light evening meal, just bread and perhaps some fruit or vegetables, something simple to sustain the body until morning. They eat in the refectory again, listening to more reading, and then they are free for a brief period of personal time before Compline, the last service of the day. Some monks use this time to visit the library, to read or study. Some return to their cells for private prayer. Some simply sit in the warming room, enjoying the fire and the rare opportunity for quiet conversation. He chooses to walk in the cloister one more time, watching as the last light fades from the sky, as the stars begin to appear overhead. The bell for Compline rings through the darkness, its sound somehow deeper and more solemn than the other bells of the day. This is the last call to prayer, the final gathering before the great silence descends upon the monastery. The monks move through the dim corridors, their shadows dancing on the stone walls in the flickering candlelight. Each footfall is deliberate, quiet, as if the night itself demands reverence. The church is filled with a hushed stillness when they enter. The candles have been arranged with care, their flames steady in the windless space, creating pools of warm light against the encompassing darkness. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, and there is a collective sense of completion, of a day's journey coming full circle. What began in darkness before dawn will end in darkness after sunset, the rhythm as old as the monastery itself, as ancient as the rule that governs their lives. The psalms chosen for Compline are ones of protection and trust. The words speak of lying down in safety, of God watching over those who sleep, of darkness being no darkness at all to the divine eye that sees everything. Medieval monks understood night differently than people do in later centuries. Without electric lights, without the ability to simply switch on a lamp and banish the shadows, darkness was absolute and sometimes frightening. Night was when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed thinner, when demons might prowl, when the soul faced its deepest fears and uncertainties. But Compline was the church's answer to that fear. The service was a deliberate act of placing oneself in God's hands, an acknowledgement that humans are vulnerable in sleep, unconscious and defenseless, and therefore dependent on divine protection. The monks sang these psalms not just as rote recitation, but as genuine prayer, asking for safety through the dangerous hours of night. The hymn for Compline was particularly beautiful, a melody that seemed designed for darkness, its notes falling like drops of water into a still pool. The Latin words spoke of Christ as a light in the darkness, as a guardian who never sleeps, who watches over his children through all the hours when they cannot watch over themselves. Medieval people genuinely believed in the reality of spiritual warfare, in the idea that fallen angels moved through the world seeking to harm and mislead, and that only God's protection kept faithful Christians safe. After the Psalms and hymn came the Nunc Dimittis, the Canticle of Simeon from the Gospel of Luke. This was the song of an old man who had seen the infant Christ and was ready to die, his life's purpose fulfilled. "Now let your servant depart in peace," the words began. And every night the monks sang these words, symbolically preparing for death, the final sleep from which one wakes in eternity. Medieval monks lived with an acute awareness of mortality, not in a morbid way, but as a constant reminder that earthly life was temporary, that their true home was elsewhere. The service concluded with a blessing and the sprinkling of holy water. The abbot moved through the church with a small silver vessel, flicking blessed water over the assembled monks. This was apotropaic magic in its Christian form. The water, having been prayed over and consecrated, transformed into a substance that could drive away evil spirits and protect the faithful. The drops landed cold on skin and fabric, a tangible reminder of baptism, of the soul washed clean, of protection secured through sacred ritual. And then came the moment that defined the monastic night, the beginning of the Great Silence. From the end of Compline until after the morning mass, no monk was permitted to speak except in the most extreme emergency. This was not merely a rule about noise, though the practical benefit of allowing sleep was obvious. The Great Silence was a spiritual discipline, a recognition that night was a time for interior reflection, for listening rather than speaking, for attending to the voice of God in the quietness of one's own heart. The monks filed out of the church in complete silence. No whispered conversations, no quiet words of good night, nothing but the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on stone and the rustle of woolen habits. They moved through the monastery like shadows, each man making his way to his own sleeping space, alone with his thoughts and his prayers. In many medieval monasteries, monks slept in a large communal dormitory, rows of simple beds separated by minimal partitions, if any at all. Privacy was not a concept that the medieval mind valued in the same way later centuries would. The community was paramount, and even in sleep, monks remained together, their collective breathing and occasional snores, a reminder that they were never truly alone, that they were part of something larger than themselves. Each bed was simple almost to the point of severity. A straw mattress, perhaps a thin wool blanket, a pillow that might be nothing more than a folded piece of cloth, or a small sack stuffed with chaff. Medieval people slept differently than their modern descendants would. They often slept in a semi-upright position, propped up on pillows, because lying flat was associated with death, with the position of a corpse laid out for burial. They also practiced what historians would later call segmented sleep, waking naturally in the middle of the night for an hour or two of quiet prayer or contemplation before returning to sleep until dawn. He prepared for sleep with the same ritualized attention he brought to every other activity of the day. He removed his scapula, the long apron-like garment worn over the habit during work, and folded it carefully. He kept his habit on, as most monks did, sleeping in the same basic garment they wore during the day. Nakedness was associated with vulnerability and shame, with the fallen condition of humanity after Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. To be clothed, even in sleep, was to maintain a boundary, a protective covering for the body. He knelt beside his bed for a final private prayer. This was his own communication with God, unmediated by liturgy or collective recitation. He reviewed the day in his mind, considering his actions, his thoughts, his failures and successes. Medieval spiritual practice emphasized what was called the examination of conscience, a daily reckoning with oneself, an honest assessment of where one had fallen short of the monastic ideal. He thought about the moments when his mind had wandered during the divine office, when he had been thinking about his next meal rather than focusing on the psalm he was singing. He thought about a moment of irritation he had felt when another scribe accidentally bumped his desk, jostling his carefully positioned manuscript. These were small things, venial sins rather than mortal ones, but they mattered. The monastic life was built on attention to small things, on the understanding that spiritual formation happened through countless tiny choices made throughout each day. He asked for forgiveness, for strength to do better tomorrow, for protection through the night. And then he climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket over himself, feeling the prickle of straw through the mattress fabric. The dormitory was cold, the stone walls offering little insulation against the winter chill, and he could see his breath in the faint moonlight that filtered through the high, narrow windows. Around him, other monks were settling into their own beds. He could hear the creaking of wooden bed frames, the rustle of straw, the soft sound of someone coughing, and then, gradually, silence descended. Real silence, profound silence, the kind that only happens when dozens of people have simultaneously committed to making no sound whatsoever. In that silence, he could hear things normally masked by human noise. The wind moving around the monastery buildings, finding gaps and creating eerie whistling sounds. The scratch of a mouse or rat moving through the walls, seeking food and warmth. The distant hoot of an owl hunting in the fields beyond the monastery walls. The creak and groan of the building itself, stone and timber expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the monastery breathing in its sleep. Medieval nights were alive with sounds that later centuries would silence or drive away. Wolves still roamed the forests of Europe, and on some nights their howls carried on the wind, reminding the monks that civilization was a thin veneer over wildness, that the ordered life of the monastery existed within a larger world that was dangerous and untamed. Travellers caught out after dark faced real risks, not just from animals, but from bandits, from getting lost in the unmarked landscape, from the simple fact that a fall or injury that would be inconvenient in daylight could be fatal in the dark. But here, within these thick stone walls, there was safety. The monastery was built like a fortress, and in troubled times it often served as one, with villagers seeking refuge during wars or raids. The massive wooden doors were barred at night, the gates locked, guards posted if the times were particularly dangerous. The monks slept secure in the knowledge that their walls were strong, their doors locked, their community protected. Sleep came slowly, as it often did. His mind continued to turn over the events of the day, returning again and again to the manuscript he was copying, to the specific psalm he had been working on. He found himself mentally reviewing the Latin, checking his memory of the words, making sure he had not made any errors. Even in the approach to sleep, his work continued, his mind unable to fully let go of the task that occupied so many of his waking hours. He thought about the centuries of monks who had slept in this very dormitory before him, men whose names he would never know, whose faces had been forgotten, but whose prayers and work had built and sustained this place. The bed he lay in had been used by others before him and would be used by others after him. He was just one link in a chain that stretched backward to the monastery's foundation. and forward into an unimaginable future. Medieval people had a different relationship with time than their descendants would develop. They lived in what historians would call liturgical time, where the seasons were marked not by secular holidays, but by the church calendar, where each day was defined by its position in that sacred cycle. They also had a different sense of the relationship between past, present, and future. The past was not dead and gone, but living and present, accessible through prayer and memory, through the saints who could intercede from heaven, through the wisdom preserved in ancient texts. Sometime in the middle of the night, he woke. This was normal, expected, the segmented sleep pattern that medieval people took for granted. Around him, other monks were also awake, lying quietly in their beds, using this wakeful period for private prayer and meditation. The great silence still prevailed, but there was a sense of shared wakefulness, of a community engaged in the same spiritual practice, even though each man prayed alone. He prayed in the darkness, his lips moving silently, his mind focusing on familiar words. The Jesus prayer was a favorite for these night watches, a simple phrase repeated over and over. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The repetition was not mindless but meditative, a way of focusing the attention, of creating a rhythm that matched the breath, that synchronized body and spirit. Eastern Christian monks had developed elaborate teachings about this kind of prayer, about how the constant repetition could lead to what they called prayer of the heart, where the prayer continued almost automatically, where it became as natural and unconscious as breathing. Western monks were aware of these teachings and incorporated some of them into their own practice, though the Western approach tended to be more structured, more tied to liturgy and communal observance. The night watch prayer was also a practical discipline. Medieval monks understood that the devil was most active at night, that temptation came most strongly in the dark hours when one was alone and vulnerable. To pray through the night was to arm oneself against spiritual attack, to maintain vigilance, to refuse to surrender the night to the powers of darkness. It was spiritual warfare conducted through the simple but profound act of prayer. After perhaps an hour of this quiet wakefulness, he felt sleep returning. He let the prayer trail off, let his mind relax, let his body sink back into the straw mattress. Around him, other monks were doing the same, the dormitory settling back into sleep. The second sleep, as it was called, was often deeper and more restful than the first, perhaps because the mind had processed the day's events during the wakeful period, perhaps because the spiritual discipline of the night watch created a sense of peace and security. He dreamed, though he would remember little of it when he woke. Medieval people took dreams very seriously, believing that God could communicate through dreams, that angels might visit in sleep, that the soul could travel while the body rested. But they also believed that demons could create false dreams, deceptive visions designed to mislead and confuse. Discernment was necessary, and monks were taught not to trust dreams too readily, to test them against scripture and church teaching, to seek guidance from their spiritual superiors before acting on any revelation received in sleep. The hours of the night passed in this alternation of sleep and wakefulness. The monastery around him was never entirely silent or entirely still. There were always some monks awake, some engaged in assigned duties. The watchman made his rounds, checking that all was secure. The infirmarian might be tending to a sick brother, administering medicine, or simply providing comfort. In times of particular devotion, some monks might spend the entire night in prayer before the altar, a voluntary ascetic practice that demonstrated exceptional commitment. And then, in what seemed like both no time at all and an eternity, the first bell began to ring. It was still completely dark outside, no hint of dawn yet visible in the narrow windows. But the bell knew the time even if human eyes could not see it. Vigils, the night office, the service that marked the darkest hour before dawn. The cycle beginning again, the wheel turning, the eternal round of prayer that defined monastic life. The monks rose from their beds with practiced efficiency. There was no grogginess, no reluctant lingering in the warmth of blankets. They had trained themselves to wake fully and immediately, to respond to the bell as soldiers respond to a trumpet call. The great silence still held, so they moved without speaking, each man knowing exactly what to do, where to go, how to prepare himself. He splashed cold water on his face from the basin kept in the dormitory for this purpose. The shock of cold was bracing, driving away any remaining sleepiness, preparing him for the prayer that was to come. He straightened his habit, ensuring that he was properly dressed, properly covered, properly prepared to enter the church and stand before God. The procession to the church happened in near total darkness. A few candles had been lit to mark the way, but their light was minimal, creating more shadows than illumination. The monks moved like ghosts through the stone corridors, their feet finding the path through memory rather than sight. They knew every stone, every turn, every step. They could have walked this path blindfolded and never stumbled. The church was cold and dark, the few candles lit for the service seeming almost swallowed by the vast darkness of the building. This was prayer at its most austere, most demanding. There was nothing comfortable about rising in the middle of the night to sing psalms in a freezing church. This was sacrifice, discipline, the voluntary embrace of hardship for the sake of spiritual growth. But as the service began, as the first psalm was chanted, something remarkable happened. The darkness seemed less oppressive, the cold less bitter. The act of prayer itself generated warmth, not physical warmth, but something else, a sense of connection and purpose that transcended bodily discomfort. The voices of the monks rose together in the darkness, and the sound was beautiful, was powerful, was a defiant assertion that light existed even in the deepest night, that hope persisted even in the coldest darkness. This was the monastic genius, the insight that had sustained this way of life for centuries. That through discipline and community, through ritual and repetition, through the embrace of hardship in pursuit of holiness, ordinary men could touch something extraordinary. That in the darkness of a medieval church, in the exhaustion of bodies pushed to their limits, in the vulnerability of souls laid bare before God, there was grace, there was meaning, there was a life worth living, a purpose worth pursuing, a truth worth any sacrifice. The service continued, psalm following psalm, the ancient words rolling out into the darkness. And when it finally concluded, when the last Amen had been sung, the monks filed out in silence, returning to their beds for a few more hours of sleep before the dawn bell rang and the whole cycle began again. Day after day, year after year, century after century, the rhythm continued, the wheel turned, the prayers rose like incense into the vaulted heavens, and the monastery persisted, a beacon of light in a dark world, a community of men dedicated to something greater than themselves, living out their days in devotion, in service, in the endless round of prayer that was their gift to God and to humanity.